Welcome, everyone, to another webinar from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Neysun Mahboubi. I'm the director of the project, and I'm delighted to continue the conversations that we've been broadcasting on this channel with today's discussion. As anyone who's familiar with our project knows, we structure the year-long fellowship for each cohort of fellows to include a on-campus meeting at the beginning of the fellowship and then a visit to China midway through, followed by a visit to Washington. And what we're basically using these different occasions for is for our fellows who are each writing a policy paper on some aspect of U.S.-China relations to be able to test out their ideas with different audiences, whether mostly academic audience on campus at Penn or more policy-relevant audiences in China, and then policy-relevant audiences in D.C. Each of the fellows in this year's cohort, and including those who you will hear from in today's program, will finalize their papers over the course of the next few months. And in January and February, we will start to publish draft versions of their policy papers. But when we go on these tours, whether they be in China or in DC, we learn a lot in general about how policymakers in the respective capitals are thinking about the relationship. So as the fellows are in the midst of finalizing their respective policy papers, we found it useful to have these checkpoints of sharing some of the main broad takeaways that the fellows have encountered, whether it be in China over the summer or in Washington, D.C. in the fall. So we've already had one of these webinars in our series right after we returned from China and had a discussion with some of the fellows of this year's cohort about their main takeaways from that experience. And now, today, we're having another discussion that is tied to the fellows' very, very productive and fruitful discussions in Washington, D.C. in September. So that's the point of today's program. You will hear from some of the fellows of this group, and you will hear a little bit about the ideas they're developing. But most of all, we're trying to convey some broad takeaways from having had an extraordinarily rich and fruitful week of discussions in D.C. in September. Those discussions were all Chatham House rule, closed door, and we'll be very respectful of that. In broad terms, we can say that over the course of the week, we met with current government officials, former government officials, foreign diplomats, journalists, academics, think tankers, the widest possible policy community you could imagine in Washington, D.C., thinking about U.S.-China relations. And each of the people you're going to hear about will draw on that overall set of meetings to share their broad takeaways. But we will, of course, be respectful of the Chatham House rule nature of those discussions and not be more specific about that. I think we will still have a lot to share. There will be a lot of insight. And I think this will be a particularly interesting moment to have this conversation because just a couple of hours ago, there seems to be some new movement in maybe a different direction in U.S.-China relations for anyone who has saw President Trump's Truth Social post. So we are having this conversation at a moment when maybe the landscape that we encountered in D.C. in September is changing or will be consistent with some of the things that we saw. That's part of what we'll be discussing in today's webinar. But let me bring the panelists up on stage so we can actually start that conversation and see what they all think, both about what they learned in D.C. Back in September and what seems to be happening now. On screen, you see 4 of the fellows of the third cohort, the present cohort of the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. In the order that I see them, I see first Josh Busby, who is professor of public affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He's part of our climate and environment group. Then I see Wyne, a senior research and advocacy advisor for U.S.-China relations at the International Crisis Group. Ali is part of our research and education team. Then I see Neil Thomas, who is Senior Fellow for Chinese Politics at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. And Neil is part of our national security group. And then Elizabeth Donkervoort, who is the co-founder of the China Strategic Risks Institute and is part of our human rights, law, and democracy team. Thank you all for spending this hour with our audience, whether live here on Zoom or watching on YouTube, and let's get the conversation going. Why don't I start with Ali? Ali, um, let's just think back to the week in DC, for starters. At the end of that week, given all the kinds of discussions we had, and I mentioned in my intro the kinds of people that we met, what were your broad takeaways about the direction of U.S.-China policy, and in particular, the direction of thinking within Washington about the U.S.-China relationship?
Thanks, Neysun. I would say two broad takeaways. So the first takeaway from I think almost all of the conversations that we had, I think more of a consensus that China is America's principal strategic competitor. I think that that consensus has only intensified. On the other hand, in juxtaposition, once we get past that diagnostic, the diagnostic that says that China is America's foremost strategic competitor, I think that the sort of the notion or the presumption of a policy consensus appears even wobblier. I think that on a lot of first order fundamental prescriptive questions, so what are the best policies for the United States to pursue to avoid a military confrontation with China, whether over the Taiwan Strait or maritime disputes in the South China Sea? What is the ideal economic relationship between the United States and China that would avoid some of the security risks of being too entangled with China, but that would also preempt some of the risk of being sort of too pulled apart? And ultimately, what is it that the United States seeks to accomplish in its relationship vis-a-vis China? Should the United States merely attempt to manage the relationship? Should it attempt to win, whatever win means? So I guess just to recap, I think certainly more of a consensus than since even I think all of us here on the screen began, our fellowship with the Penn Project that China is our foremost strategic competitor. But I think a little bit more of a sense of lack of clarity over what to do with that diagnostic.
Great. And when you think about that lack of clarity over what to do about it, were you left more optimistic or pessimistic that we can achieve that clarity in some kind of recognizably
Yeah.
discrete time period ahead?
Yeah. So I'm a congenital optimist, and not starry-eyed. I'm a congenital optimist. I think my point would be that the United States and China, they don't really have a choice but to find some way of getting on, some way of coexisting. You mentioned this, Nason, in your introductory remarks, the president's recent post on Truth Social, and in a way, although I think that that post, which we might discuss later, it certainly points to, I think, more turbulence ahead, at least in the economic dimensions of the relationship. I think the flip side is that it suggests, I think, a growing recognition in both, or I would hope a growing recognition in both Washington and Beijing, that while economic interdependence, it's not a panacea, it does introduce vulnerabilities, it can also be a source of mutual restraint. And I think that the more that the United States and China appreciate that, look, the United States can slow down China in certain ways, it has chips to play. China, for its part, has important sources of economic leverage. To the extent that there's a growing internalization in both Washington and Beijing that, look, whether we like it or not, begrudgingly, we are interdependent. We both can impose important sources of economic leverage over the other. Hopefully, that mutual recognition and internalization of economic leverage can point the way towards mutual restraint.
So that's just to stay on you for one more moment, Ali,
Sure.
that's a answer that suggests that there's a particular approach that might gain traction, but that's sort of separate from, will we reach a consensus at all? Which, is in some ways the predicate question. Like, is there room for, and in either direction, either the direction that I think you're normatively arguing for, or in the other direction, which would be against what you're arguing for, do you think that there is room for consensus on these challenging issues that have, in many ways, bedeviled us for the last few years.
So here I will say, despite being a congenital optimist, my sense is that now we're going to see, I think, a much sharper debate on this particular question that you posed. And I can imagine that in response to the president's Truth Social post, in response to sort of the tit for tat, these volleys that we see economically, I can imagine, one school of thought gaining traction, which is, look, what China has done is, at least in the United States, that what China has done is further evidence that we need to de-risk more aggressively. We need to maybe even think about much more aggressive de-risking in the direction of decoupling. I can also see another school of thought gaining traction that says, look, we are far more dependent on China than we had anticipated, and vice versa, and we don't want to succumb to what some have termed mutually assured economic destruction. So I could imagine some in that camp saying, look, we've tested each other enough. We've demonstrated economic leverage. Let's try to calm down the water. So I can imagine one school of thought saying, look, we need to de-risk more aggressively, maybe even in the direction of decoupling. And I can imagine others advocating for more mutual restraint. But I think that debate it's beginning, and I think that debate is going to intensify in the weeks and months ahead.
Great. Let me pick on someone else for a little bit. Let's go to Neil. So again, Neil, let's go back to that initial question, which is just what were your takeaways at the. We'll have a lot of time in this discussion to go back and look at, what's happening in this moment and what the future direction is going to be. But when you think back to our week in DC and the takeaways you had at the end of that week, what stands out to you?
Thanks, Neysun. Yeah, I think I had three kind of overarching takeaways from that week of conversations with former policymakers, current officials, and various academics, diplomats, journalists in DC. I think the first one is that there's a lot of confusion about US policy on China right now. What are the priorities that Washington has when it comes to its competition or engagement or whatever with Beijing? And there was a kind of a sense that China policy is a bit more of a mood than a strategy at the moment. And I think events today really, show how quickly we can swing between détente and escalation in US-China relations. But it also wasn't just a partisan point, not at all. I mean, the point is that China's strategy is fundamentally hard. And even under the Biden administration, that arguably was, a much kind of bigger whole of administration effort on China. Despite all that kind of rhetoric and all the moves there, it was actually really hard to coordinate lots of different agencies with different interests, to focus on China, to focus on even on the same page about what the assumptions for the relationship should be. And it's almost inevitable that US foreign policy is going to get distracted a lot by what's happening in Europe and the Middle East, lots of existing kind of equities there. The second major point was on export controls. They've got less attention in the first few months of the Trump administration than they had during the Biden admin. But my sense is that there's still significant energy and support in the Beltway for export controls to be, a significant feature of U.S. policy on China. So they're on pause now, but especially after China's, unprecedented export controls on rare earths. I think um, chips is an obvious starting point to kind of expand them, but I think biotechnology as well is an area that hasn't really got a lot of attention yet, but there's a lot of kind of work that's being done in DC on export controls in that area. So that's kind of a watch point. And then finally, the third point is that Taiwan matters. There's a major concern in DC about Chinese intentions there, especially if there is confusing signals coming from DC, and a lot of work being done behind the scenes to try and maintain deterrence, especially on the Hill and in the administration outside the White House. And there's a broader point there as well about allies and partners, and there's significant energy to on the Hill in departments to maintain and preserve those relationships, even if there's some unhappiness abroad about U.S. tariff policy and other things coming out of DC.
I have to linger a bit on your second point, Neil, because we may be living right now through what your second point sort of suggested we heard was this idea that there's so much volatility on the US side, or at least maybe that's not the right way to say it. I think the right way to say it is that there is enough concern about China just under the surface of what has been maybe a more friendly posture in recent months, that as soon as something happened to trigger concern, all of that underlying sentiment would come out more robustly. And so, I guess maybe I wanted to say a little bit more about that perspective. And as a precursor to this discussion, is that what we're living through right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing, living in DC myself for many months now, that across multiple departments, where the people are pretty much the same below the very top levels as they were under the Biden and the first Trump administrations, that, there's been a lot of work that's continued to, prepare draft executive orders or draft legislation that would significantly increase, export control regimes directed at chips, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, biotech, with an emphasis on China and cutting off, US technology at the top end for Chinese firms. And I mean, it seems from reading between the lines of Trump's Truth Social post earlier that, I mean, maybe tariffs and financial sanctions even could be top of mind for him right now. But it does seem like, if I was sitting there in the government and, I wanted policy to go in a different direction and I had, my draft EO's draft legislation ready to go, now's a good time to get those in front of the president and kind of capture this current mood of surprise and shock at these export controls that have come out of China, which,
When you say now, literally Friday,
yeah,
October 10th
exactly.
at 2 p.m. Eastern time is now, is the
I mean,
moment.
the best time to drop major policies is Friday evening, right? When everyone else is trying to go to the pub or finish up for the weekend.
And Neil, just to also talk a moment with you about Taiwan, again, all of these things are dynamic. That's hopefully what makes our conversation today interesting to the wider audience. But at least at the end of that week in DC, how were you feeling about what you could sense about our commitment or readiness, depth of support for at least, let's say, maintaining the status quo across the Taiwan Strait?
I think there's still a lot of support for that, and in some ways, the you know uh, White House level signals to this are a bit more noise than actual signal. The kind of across the administration, across the bipartisan set of politicians in DC. There's really strong support for at least maintaining the status quo. Less consensus to Ali's point about what's the optimum cadence of U.S. policy towards cross-strait relations. But I think even Trump himself, he hates war, right? He will not want to see Beijing, creating trouble and launching a big shooting war in the Taiwan Strait. That's going to make him look bad. That's going to undermine the peacemaker image. And I think he does care about America's image in the world. I mean, why else is he getting so involved in all of these conflicts? And why does he even want a Nobel Peace Prize, right? That's actually quite a kind of, 1990s unipolar moment window of U.S. foreign policy. So I think that we, should be alert but not alarmed about cross-strait relations in the Trump administration.
Good. I'm sure we're going to come back to that later in the conversation, but let's move now to Elizabeth. And again, pose the same question to you at the end of that week in DC. What were your broad takeaways from all the discussions that we had?
Thanks, Neysun. And, I agree completely with what Ali and Neil were saying. What I, coming from the human rights and democracy stream of this cohort really took away from was this idea that human rights really is not a priority at all. That was the through line for me in all of our meetings, is it really wasn't an issue that came to the fore, like technology, like clean energy, Taiwan. Certainly those were the big issues of concern. But, it was somewhat alarming to me, although not surprising, because if we're going to go back to the US's reputation, as Neil was just mentioning, globally, its biggest counterpoint to the PRC has been its standing up for democratic rights and freedoms of individuals around the world. So to be shying away from that at this moment in time, and in fact, in addition to the export control notification that came out earlier today, we also had the Nobel Peace Prize announcement, and the White House's immediate response was to criticize the committee, as opposed to congratulating the Venezuelan leader of the opposition in her getting this award for her promotion of democratic rights and freedoms. So I think that was sort of the biggest takeaway for me. Though when prompted, all of the diplomats, officials, both former and present, and those working at the operational level, really were noting this critical importance and threat to democratic resilience that we are seeing in the United States. But I think in terms of priority, sort of reading between the lines of the people that we were talking to, the priority almost seems to be looking at inward threats right now, as opposed to the very real risk of transnational repression and foreign interference that the PRC poses to democracies around the world, and which was actually the main focal point of the G7 conference in June. And so I was very disappointed to see that wasn't even kind of a blip on the initial reaction from the people that we spoke with.
And how much, Elizabeth, would you ascribe that to the ecosystem that would normally be contributing to that type of point having been so much dismantled in recent months?
Well, I mean, we are seeing a lot of committees and commissions trying to step in and fill that void. I think there have been about 11 different hearings talking about different components of China's impact on the United States over the course of this year. But certainly, in side conversations that I was having outside of sort of the formal discussions we were having, this dismantling of DRL in particular, as well as funding challenges to NED, have been problematic in terms of the channels of information that have been able to flow to people and policymakers in DC. And certainly I think that's consistent with what we've been having in outside discussions with academia throughout the year.
Yeah. Very, very, very troubling developments. Let's move on now to Josh. And Josh, again, the initial question, just what at the end of that week, what were your broadest takeaways? And maybe especially given that you're part of our climate and environment team in relation to those sets of issues.
Sure. Thanks, Neysun. I think climate, energy, and even minerals were pretty tangential to most of the topics we discussed in our recent visit to DC. I think the broader trade relationship and issues like Taiwan have been discussed were more central. And that might be related to the people who we spoke with, though we did have discussions with a wide variety of actors. I want to come back to something that was raised earlier about the prospects for a grand bargain at this moment in time. There's I think a sense from our conversations in Beijing earlier this summer and DC recently that there might now perhaps be more space under President Trump than there was under President Biden to improve relations between the two countries. And maybe that's related to the growing realization that China isn't going anywhere, the US isn't going anywhere, and the two countries need to figure out a modus vivendi for coexisting along the lines that Ali suggested. And I think that opening appears even as the two countries have entered into a more fractious and sort of serious disruption in trade relations. And that openness, again, might be related to the fact that President Trump doesn't care all that much about China's rise and efforts to carve out a sphere of influence in Asia or possibly even absorb Taiwan down the road. That's certainly not true of the wider policy establishment, but he himself may not be as exercised by those concerns. And there's
and let's just put a footnote, Josh, as of this morning, maybe.
Right.
But maybe that literally is changing as we're speaking.
And I think, I'll come back to that in a second. I think a growing realism on the part of the administration might also be informed by the severe, emergent shortages in rare earths that emerged over the summer in the wake of China's export restrictions. And that sort of seemed to bring the Trump administration to the table, including loosening export restrictions of its own on some semiconductor chips. Now, you talked earlier about how China yesterday imposed new sweeping restrictions on rare earths, content and export products, and there were actually others that were imposed on anode and cathode technologies. And I think that might have been an opening gambit by China to increase its bargaining leverage. As President Trump and President Xi were set to have that meeting on the margins of the upcoming APEC discussions in South Korea. But in response, President Trump's threatened new tariffs and cast doubt on whether a meeting will even happen. So, and I think this volatility in the relationship underscores a challenge for folks writing and advocating in this space. We tend to assume a sort of normal policy environment in which ideas like ones coming from outside actors become part of the conversation between different government actors, Congress and the executive branch agencies, as they try to formulate national policy direction. And I think in a world in which U.S. policy is increasingly driven by the tenor and tone of a single individual, then we're in somewhat uncharted waters where interagency processes of consultation, separation of powers may be moot, and we might have to have our own criminology of the moods and intrigue associated with how our own leader thinks about China's moves. So,
although I have to
yeah.
admit that like reading Truth Social posts is a lot easier than traditional criminology. So there is a transparency there that does not,
Yeah, but
have
even
the
those
same
are
level of
strategic.
difficulty.
That even those are, take them at face value, is that he, in a fit of pique, typed something out this morning, but it may be a strategic effort on his part to, up the stakes so that the bargaining leverage in a meeting that will still happen goes more favorably for the U.S. So, I mean, that may be giving it a little more planning and purpose than it portends. But I think to the extent that we're able to get some reaction from parts of the government on our ideas, and I can talk about that, several of us from the climate and energy perspective have noted that, China's now on the technological frontier for things like batteries and electric vehicles. And while the administration is hostile to clean technology, it kind of recognizes the importance of batteries and the minerals that go into them, at least for military uses like drones. And so several of us have been arguing that the U.S. needs to encourage more licensing deals and foreign direct investment from Chinese firms in these sectors to onshore capabilities and supply chains, sort of China playbook in reverse to bring intellectual property back to the United States. Because Chinese battery and EV firms know how to make the latest battery chemistries and EVs at scale at an affordable cost. And so encouraging Chinese companies to set up shop here with joint ventures or licensing agreements could offer an off-ramp for trade tensions, similar to the approach that the U.S. took with Japan in the 80s. And it might provide some competition for U.S. car makers to kind of improve their offerings. And so some of the interlocutors we spoke with from the U.S. government seem to think that this would just reward the Chinese auto sector at a time when they think it's in trouble, given overcapacity, financial problems, that there's still something like 150 car companies vying for influence in the Chinese market. And so it seems like that even if a number of external observers, like some of us, think a role for Chinese companies in the U.S. market might be good for the country, that the baseline bipartisan anti-China hostility that we observed in the Biden era is still pretty strongly represented in both the executive branch and Congress. So President Trump and his advisors would really have to commit some political capital to change that, because I think the direction of travel might still be towards decoupling, even as it becomes more clear that isn't realistic or could be catastrophic. And I'll say one final thing. I was struck by a statistic that appeared in a CNBC article about Japan and the kind of rare earths episode in 2010 when China tried to restrict rare earths to Japan over a territorial dispute. And Japan was importing like 90% of its rare earths from China at the time. And so in response, they went through this episode to try and reduce their dependence through some support for Australian firms. They also did recycling. They've also tried to figure out how to re-engineer products to be less rare earth dependent. And so by 2023, they got the percentage of Chinese imports down to 60%, with the goal to be 50% by the end of 2025. So we're kind of fooling ourselves if we think that, between today, when we're like 95% plus dependent on Chinese rare earths exports and through investments in, I don't know, MP materials or other onshoring efforts in the US, that magically we're going to be able to get our dependence down to zero. And so we should have some modest aspirations for that. And if we end up in a world in which, relations go off the rails and we end up with an abrupt decoupling, we should expect some very difficult times ahead.
Yeah, that's all very, very interesting, Josh. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that you and your colleagues in the climate environment team this year, Maggie Jackson and Kyle Chan, I think generally speaking, your three papers are all in the same vein of you know advocating for in general for the U.S. to pursue clean energy technologies and to basically realize possibilities for learning from Chinese innovation in those respects and putting them into practice here. You sort of talked about this, but I guess I want you to say just a few more words about what you thought the overall reception to those ideas were over the course of the week, not just from the officials, but more generally. Did you feel like the kind of approach that you and Maggie and Kyle, which I think to a large extent basically reflects the perspective of the climate and environment community generally, did you feel like there was a sympathetic audience in DC for any of those ideas, or not, or somewhere in between?
I think because the wider environment over clean technologies is so fraught at the moment that it's hard to imagine that there's that much space or interest for it. To the extent that if we start to uh, disentangle the clean and environmental component of it and just think about battery technologies or something, there may be more space for that, but it's sort of bound up with two things: it's sort of a high level of you bipartisan anti-China sentiment, and then clean technology, which is anathema to the current administration. We're kind of in no man's land. And so you either have to have an effort to move beyond the current, anti-China sentiment that, is pretty strong in both parties, and then uh, you start to separate parts of the clean technology space from the current administration's point of view. And if to the extent that that's possible, there may be some movement, but um, you know, that's where I think we have to maybe look around the corner and recognize that in a couple of years from now, things may look quite different in that basically the clean energy transition in the auto space is coming. It's a question of when, not whether. Major automobile companies know that, and that that may change sentiment in time as political leaders realize that the future is electric in the auto space. And so we're either, in the fight to have a important part of the market be coming from U.S. companies, or we abandon that and kind of leave our auto sector to be like the, fossil fuel horse and buggy industry of yore.
I was listening to you and recalling a comment that at least came up once, and maybe even more times in response to your ideas and the ideas of your team,
Mhm.
which was that when some people think that we still have vulnerabilities in terms of different aspects of the trade relationship, your ideas to them seem like you're opening up new vulnerabilities. So I think one person said,
Yeah.
we haven't even solved the old vulnerabilities, and you're potentially opening up new vulnerabilities. How did that comment land with you as you were sort of reacting in real time?
Well, obviously, if we were going to open up the U.S. market to, say, Chinese EVs, then there are all these attendant concerns about internet connected technologies and the previous administration's sort of ban on Chinese internet connected software in those systems. And so we'd have to figure out a workaround. But we're figuring out, I don't know, workarounds on TikTok. That may involve sales to local U.S. companies, but previous solutions were localization of data collection. And I think that there's a solution there, but it would require us to kind of think well beyond the current moment, which is, uh, you know, which would be more deeply enmeshing us with China, not, decoupling. And so that would really be a challenge to the current direction of travel that we're on. But there was a great podcast, emergency podcast on China Talk this morning, not to encourage people to, consume other media, but they were reflecting on the prospects for a grand bargain in this space. And some of the similar sets of concerns came up there. And I just think that, Trump would really have to lean in on that if he wanted to pursue that
And,
approach.
if they were having an emergency podcast on the possibility of a grand bargain, maybe by afternoon, the emergency is gone. So they can maybe have a more relaxed weekend.
Well, the emergency was on the rare earth stuff, but this came up at the end.
Right. So let's move to the second question, and I might just do the reverse order. And so I'll just stay with you, Josh, because we've been talking a lot about the reception to your ideas. Again, all of you, along with the rest of your cohort, your draft papers will be made public in January and February. We'll have webinars like this one for you to discuss them. So, you still have time to think through your ideas, and I don't want to kind of, cannibalize the discussion in January and February. But I am curious, you could say maybe a few words about what you're writing on and to what extent is your approach to writing about that, or some of the ways you're arguing it, have they been impacted by the experience we had in DC? Is there any way in which you might be thinking of recrafting some aspects of your argument based on what we encountered and the feedback you got in DC?
So the way I've been thinking about it is that batteries are becoming ubiquitous as semiconductors, with a wide variety of applications in drones, in hybridized military vehicles, in EVs, in battery storage. And so I'm trying to make that move to separate batteries in particular from just clean tech. And let's just take it's just technology, and it's integral to the future of the country's financial health. We need a healthy, robust battery industry in the US, because batteries are going to be in everything, like chips are in everything. And so we need to be able to make that stuff here. And so that's the sort of way I'm thinking about it. And the only way to make that stuff here is through robust scientific research into those processes, but also learning from the best. And the best right now is, coming out of China, and we've got to figure out how to get that stuff back here. It was invented here, ended up being commercialized and scaled there. They're good at that. And we're not where we need to be. And so if we want to be where we ultimately, have to be to, for national security concerns, economic competitive concerns, then we need a robust battery industry here. And that's not simply finished batteries. That's the whole supply chain. And we've done a lot in previous years. We, 3/4 of the battery consumption for the electric vehicle market is actually produced in the US. We kind of, the sort of 1/4 that remains, or the 30% that remains, is mostly imported from China. But most of the finished batteries are assembled and manufactured here, but everything that goes into them, mostly comes from other places, and much of it coming from China. And so we've got to change that. And so the one thing I'm advocating is that the rules that are emergent under the One Big Beautiful Bill shouldn't foreclose our opportunities to learn from China. I'm concerned, though, that those Treasury rules, which haven't come out yet, will probably come out between now and January. So some of this could be OBE, but even if those rules come out, if there's a grand bargain on the table, maybe there'll be flexibilities in interpretation or revisiting them, because we have like the Ford CATL licensing agreement, but that may be the last of its kind.
Interesting. We'll find out more in January, or February, depending on the schedule. Okay, so Elizabeth, the same question to you. Why don't you just say a few words about what you're writing on for the project, and how either your thinking evolved about it over the course of the week in DC, or your thinking about how to present it maybe evolved.
Oh, sure. So my paper is a little bit different than a lot of the other papers in this cohort. I'm looking at subnational diplomacy. So that's engagement between state and local, so municipal actors with their counterparts in the PRC, and in particular, helping these policymakers and other actors navigate that gray space where legitimate public diplomacy starts evolving into foreign interference, which is illegitimate, as well as transnational repression. And it's going to be creating a framework that policymakers can then overlay with other risk assessments that they're doing, because as we all know, state and local policymakers in particular have very stretched bandwidth in relation to their priorities to their communities, which are much more directly local. My reception to this paper in DC, even though it was subnational level, was very strong on the one hand, but there was an acknowledgement that resources to supporting this type of work, which had previously been there under other administrations, in particular the Biden administration had created a subnational diplomacy unit in the State Department, that has now been sort of dissolved, and those actors that were trying to assist subnational diplomacy makers in their space have been put into more regional areas, or as opposed to a functional area. And so that's going to be a really big challenge, I think, moving forward. And so that's been helping me think through how I need to restructure my recommendations, not only for subnational policymakers, but also policymakers at the federal level. And one other sort of takeaway that I had from all of this is, there's subnational diplomacy is a central component of the PRC's diplomatic efforts through a variety of different channels. In contrast, in the United States, it's been much more siloed. And as Ali and Neil mentioned, there hasn't been a very consistent policy related to China at even the federal level, which is compounded when you're looking at the subnational level. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of confusion, and it makes it even harder for these policymakers to navigate this space in the absence of resources, in the absence of clarity at the federal level of what the policies actually are. So we're moving even further away from a way where these kind of relationships can be normalized in a very fruitful way at the subnational level, which is really going to, I think, be problematic moving forward, because we'll be missing a lot of opportunities where legitimate engagement that can be benefiting our communities in the United States is just not going to happen, sort of out of fearful rhetoric or just lack of resources.
Super interesting. I hope that everyone else in the audience their appetite is as whetted as mine is now for the more developed versions of these papers in a few months. Neil, same question to you. Maybe what are you writing about, and how did the week in DC impact your thinking about it?
I am doing a project on US-China back-channel diplomacy, and I think the real benefit of having these conversations in DC with people who have been involved directly or who have been supervising back-channel diplomacy for many years is that the real value adds not going to come from recommending specific types of new dialogues or new arrangements, because that's going to depend a lot on the context of US-China relations at any given moment. And as we've been talking about a lot, that can shift quite suddenly. But what's going to be more important for ensuring that back channels are there and are useful when they need to be is institutionalizing things like review processes in the executive, institutionalizing interactions like pre-briefing and debriefing, particularly important track 2s, track 1.5s that already exist and perhaps have a history as well. And then specifically, we had some conversations about the Mutual Educational and Cultural Exchange Act, or MICA, a section of which basically creates exchange programs that other countries can create for American employees of the federal government, which includes senators, representatives, and their staff. And since 2020, China's been struck off from that list because these trips that it was organizing under MICA were branded as soft power propaganda tools. But I think, to me, given the evolution of the conversation about China, the raising of awareness about the problematic parts of China's foreign policy and influence operations in the United States, that I don't think anyone's going to fall for it, quite frankly, in the sense of, betraying their patriotism and allegiance to the United States, especially with, a robust set of, pre-trip briefings about security and political situation in China. And I think, in terms of actually mobilizing the American government and a lot of politicians whose focus is on domestic issues and aren't engaged in the day-to-day of US-China relations, sort of mobilizing attention and raising awareness about how good China is at industrial policy and at building things. I think every American politician and staffer should visit China, go to the Huawei factory, go to CATL, go and see what they're up against, go and see what China's actually like. And I am far less concerned about any of those patriotic Americans being compromised than I am about people not giving sufficient attention to China in DC, given, as we've seen, there's a lot of other things going on in the world, and there's not actually a lot of awareness about China's real strengths and weaknesses. And that I think will be enhanced by being on the ground. And the first step to, forming good strategy is having an accurate understanding of what's going on in China. So I think that, for me, I think a specific outcome will be you're making some recommendations about leader, perhaps trying to, see if those exchanges can be restarted, because I think they're in the US national interest.
That's interesting. I mean, I definitely feel like I've noticed as time goes on that your recommendation with respect to diplomacy or back channel diplomacy increasingly has like this institutionalization component to it, and I feel like that was the feedback that a lot of the former officials, in particular, that we met with over the course of the week, were indicating. So it's just interesting to see. And the reason I sort of dwell on this is because the whole point of our project is to put people in conversations that give them feedback and new ideas, and it's like an iterative process. And so seeing something kind of come into the paper that is directly related to, a week that we spent in DC is, I think, useful. Well, we will learn more in January. So how about we go now back to Ali? And again, and Ali, I'll just say, I frankly think that of everyone in the group, possibly your paper will have the most direct impact from the conversations in DC. So maybe I'll be wrong about that, but
No
maybe
pressure.
shed light on why I think that could be the case.
No pressure. No, well, thank you, Neysun. And actually, where Neil left off in his remarks actually is sort of a perfect segue to to what I'm going to be working on. So it's one, sort of thinking about how we take more of the extraordinary China expertise that we have in not just in DC, but just around the country, but particularly amongst the up and coming generation, transferring more of that extraordinary expertise to up to Congress to shape legislation and to have in turn so that up and coming cadre of China experts learn in turn more about congressional priorities when it comes to China, but just the legislative process more generally. And then secondly, I think again to building off of Neil's points and points that Elizabeth and Josh have made as well, expanding the scope of conversations the Congress is having on China policy, whether you look at the Congressional Executive Commission on China, the U.S. Economic and Security Review Commission, the House Select Committee, which are sort of the main congressional bodies that are really driving the discourse on China. I think that we should have more sort of forward-looking conversations because I think I was saying in the outset of my remarks that there's sort of a lack of consensus about many aspects of China policy. I think that there is something approaching a consensus that the nature of the U.S.-China relationship is going to look quite different by the time the President Trump successor takes office. The international environment is going to look a lot different. I think the U.S.-China relationship is going to look a lot different. And so I think having those bodies that I just mentioned, having them expand the scope of their hearings, also solicit testimonies from more witnesses to think about, what aspects of the relationship will look different, come January of 2029. What additional constraints might there be on both sort of American policy vis-a-vis China? What additional opportunities might there be in order to recalibrate U.S. policy towards China? So really just, building again off of where Neil left off. So one, thinking about what we can do to take, and I'll just give a little bit more detail on this first idea is, maybe having a consortium of there are many organizations in the broad sort of civil society ecosystem that sponsor congressional fellows on any range of on any number of topics. So maybe having kind of a comparable consortium of organizations selecting folks, under 35 who have a real focus on China policy, placing them in Congress with certain committees or certain offices so that they can transfer their expertise in form legislation, and having those members of Congress in turn and their staff giving those congressional fellows a sense of how Congress works. And then just recommendation to, again, just expanding the scope of hearings that these congressional bodies are holding, so that we think about not only what should U.S. policy vis-a-vis China be now, but what might be the different constraints and different opportunities that would present Washington lawmakers come January of 2029.
So how did any of those ideas get impacted by the conversations in DC? Did you start at the same point at the beginning of the week and end at the same point, or was there any travel in your thinking about them?
There was definitely travel, and I think again, I don't want to sound overly sanguine, and recognizing, of course, I mean, just today, just before we got started with our panel, you mentioned the president's Truth Social post, perhaps presaging a more volatile period in the U.S.-China relationship. But I would say that for me, over the course of the week, I think the direction of travel made me feel sort of more validated to develop this paper and develop these ideas. And I think that some of the folks we spoke with suggested that this is a period of flux. This is a period in which there is more room for debate, more room for discussion about some of these first order fundamental, questions, a little bit more of an openness, contra this presumption of a China policy consensus. The sense that I got the further the week progressed is that there is sort of a more intellectually and even politically fertile environment for having some of these discussions and debates. And so to the extent that we are right now introducing some ideas, getting more sort of up and coming experts into Congress, I think that there would be receptiveness to having those folks, and I think that even with these congressional bodies, I think more receptiveness to expanding the scope of their hearings. So I think for me, the direction of travel made me feel more validated in putting pen to paper and developing these ideas.
Okay, very, very interesting. I'm going to ask each of you just a last question, and then we'll wrap up for today, and then continue the conversation over the next few months and webinars in January and February. So, given everything we've talked about, and we know we've said many times that we could be in a moment of new volatility based on everything we learned in DC, everything you've been following since, what are you going to be looking at in the weeks and months ahead? What are the relevant indices that you think will shed particular light on where we're going in the U.S.-China relationship? I'll just start with you, Ali, and go back around in the same order.
Sure. So just, I mean, there are, many trends that I'll be watching. Like everyone else, I'll just mention two. One is obviously sort of, wither the economic relationship. It seemed as if we kind of had something of a trade détente. I think now that trade détente probably has been at least blown up temporarily. So where, if at all, where does that trade relationship, go? And is there that internalization, this recognition that, hey, we are much more integrated and much more vulnerable to each other? So does that awareness of mutual vulnerability introduce some degree of mutual restraint? So I'll be following that space. And then secondly, of course, I think that far more so than when President Trump was first in office, I think that the leader level channel is going to be that much more decisive in shaping the U.S.-China relationship. President Xi is far more dominant in China than he was 8 years ago. President Trump is far more dominant in American politics than he was 8 years ago. So to the extent that there are breakthroughs in their personal rapport, those could more readily translate into gains in bilateral stability. The downside is, to the extent that there are ruptures in the personal rapport between Trump and Xi, that could also mean a much more rapid propagation of instability in the relationship. So I'll be following their personal rapport very closely.
And maybe there won't be meeting in 2 weeks after all.
Right,
but
right.
we'll find out. Same question to you, Neil. What are you going to be particularly looking at in these weeks and months ahead, as to what are the most relevant indices for where the U.S.-China relationship is going?
I will drill down into some more specific indicators that hone Ali's focus on the economic relationships. I think that really is the kind of front line of competition between the US and China, or potential for détente and stabilization of relationships. And we have a few really important dates coming up. I mean, I think November 10th is when the 90-day tariff truce expires. So if we don't get a
It might be expiring Monday.
I mean, I mean, who knows what can happen, right? Things can move very quickly. But in terms of, some baked in decision points over the next few weeks. That's certainly something that's going to be interesting. If there's no meeting between Trump and Xi at APEC, probably much more likely to just expire than and tariffs to shoot up again than if there was a meeting, and which is still possible, right? I mean, the flexibility that Trump brings to foreign policy means, you can have big swings in different directions in US-China relations. So, I mean, certainly kind of the APEC meetings are the most obvious diplomatic watch point, but in terms of where the, real constraints on economic exchanges might shoot back up again, then yeah, that November 10th deadline I think is still important. And there's also comment periods that are expiring at the end of this month of October on Section 232 reports about potential for more actions, whether that be export controls, tariffs on China going forwards. That will create a new set of options for President Trump to turn to if he wants to increase pressure on China, and or if the Supreme Court rules that the IEEPA tariffs that are currently being placed on China are unconstitutional or illegal. So there'll be options that Trump can turn to without causing a constitutional crisis to put tariffs back on China and other countries. So yeah, those kind of three watch points of the APEC meeting, the tariff truce, and Section 232 reports are the three things I'm looking at.
Elizabeth, how about you?
Sure. So, again, looking at sort of subnational diplomacy and risks of foreign interference, the indices that I look at are a little bit different. So I'm going to be looking more at court cases as they relate to potential transnational repression or espionage cases that are happening, not only in the United States, but of course in the UK. We have this big sort of incident right now where a case against some potential people in the inner circle in Parliament have had their case dropped against them. I'm also going to be looking further afield to the way different countries are starting to tackle this issue of subnational interference in their own, and subnational diplomacy in their own realm. So Australia has just launched a new program last month on the Australia-China Local Government Exchange. So seeing how these sort of pilot projects play out and the way that they might be able to be brought back to the United States.
And the last word to Josh. Again, so based on what you're writing about for the project and what you learned in DC, what's happening maybe in real time right now, what are you going to be looking for as your relevant indices in the weeks and months ahead?
Sure. Obviously, the Trump administration's response to the rare earths restrictions and those on cathodes and anodes, that'll probably happen in adjacent spaces, but it'll be interesting to see how those play out. I mentioned earlier the rules related to the implementation of the One Big Beautiful Bill on prohibited foreign entities. Could be dropped anytime. And then Neil mentioned Section 232 investigations. There was one launched in April on critical minerals, and so that could come down and signal new restrictions and tariffs on other Chinese imports that go well beyond just minerals, but maybe to other component pieces. And so I think that's a watch this space. And one other thing is maybe in a broader time sweep is the congressional delegations to China that hadn't come up, but I think there was one recently, which may have been the first in a number of years, and gets at this: is there a new appetite for Americans to engage and go and learn about China and do, as Neil suggested, and see, for themselves what's going on there and what we're up against? Because I know when I went in April of last year for the first time after COVID, just traveling on relatively high speed, not the highest speed rail from Shanghai to Hefei in 2 hours, which was the equivalent of going from, I don't know, New York City to Indianapolis, and then back in a single day was just eye-opening. And then seeing factories that had the highest end, robots, soldering, car parts, it just was. Gave me a renewed appreciation for this isn't a low wage, low skill worker economy. It is at the highest end, and we've got our work cut out for us.
Wow. Well, I could keep talking to all of you, but we can bring a close to today's discussion. Obviously, we're going to have much more to talk about in the coming months, and especially early in the new year when we publish your draft papers, and a little later when we publish the final papers. Thank you all for spending your hour in this conversation. Thanks to the audience, whether here on the Zoom webinar or on YouTube or who watches this recording later. I hope you are just as excited to hear about how these ideas are finally formulated once we get to the new year. In the meantime, please keep an eye out for more programming from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations, and hope you have a good weekend.